My name is Alex Thorne. I'm 67 years old, and for 35 of those years, I was a state fish and game warden here in Montana. I've spent more of my life in the woods than out of them. I've tracked mountain lions for days. I've been bluff charged by grizzlies more times than I can count, and I once spent 4 nights in a January blizzard with nothing but a knife and the clothes on my back. I say this not to brag, but to establish a baseline. I am not a man given to flights of fancy. I am not easily spooked. I know the sounds of the forest, the tracks of its animals, and the feel of the air before a storm. The wilderness speaks a language, and I was fluent in it. I thought I was anyway. Now I know I only ever understood a few simple dialects, and the true, dark grammar of the deep woods was something I had never even heard.
My cabin sits on the western edge of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, about 12 miles up a gravel road that the county stops plowing after the first serious snow. It was my father's before it was mine, a simple A-frame with a stone fireplace, a good well, and no neighbors for at least 5 miles in any direction. It was my sanctuary, the one place on earth I felt completely at home. After my wife Sarah passed away, I started spending more and more time up there. Retirement gave me the freedom, and the silence of the mountains was a better balm for my grief than the well-meaning but hollow condolences of friends back in town. I knew the risks of being alone out there, but I was comfortable with them. I had a satellite phone for emergencies, a well-stocked pantry, and a collection of firearms that I knew how to use better than I knew how to use a television remote. I was prepared for anything the natural world could throw at me. Or so I believed. This happened last October.
The aspens had turned a brilliant, fiery gold, and the nights were getting sharp with the promise of winter. I'd driven up for a 2-week stay, planning to do some late-season elk hunting, chop firewood for the winter, and generally just enjoy the solitude before the heavy snows locked the place up until spring. The first week was idyllic. The air was crisp and clean, the sky a deep, piercing blue. I saw a herd of elk grazing in my meadow one morning, their breath pluming in the cold air. I shot a respectable bull on the 4th day, dressed it out, and hung the meat in the shed. Everything was exactly as it should be. Normal. Peaceful. The change began on the 8th day. It started not with a sight, but with a sound. It was late afternoon, and I was on the porch, oiling my rifle. The forest was quiet, that deep, humming quiet of a windless day. Then I heard it, a crash. It came from the north, up the slope of the mountain behind my cabin. It wasn't the crack of a falling branch or the rumble of a rock slide. It was a splintering, tearing sound, a violent shattering of wood on a massive scale. It sounded like a giant had snapped a full-grown pine tree over its knee. The sound was followed by a moment of absolute silence, and then a roar. I have heard every animal in these mountains. I've heard the high-pitched scream of a cougar, the guttural huff of a bear, the bugle of an elk. This was none of those. It was deep, resonant, and filled with a kind of guttural, bubbling agony that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a sound of immense pain and fury, all mixed together. It echoed off the surrounding peaks for a few seconds and then faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier and more profound than before. I sat there on my porch, my hands frozen on the stock of my rifle, every instinct I had honed over a lifetime screaming that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. My first thought was a bear. A big grizzly, maybe, that had gotten itself into some kind of trouble. Perhaps it had fallen from a ledge or gotten tangled in a deadfall. The sound was wrong for it, but in the wilderness, you learn to default to the most logical explanation first. A wounded grizzly is one of the most dangerous things on the planet. I went inside, locked the door, and chambered around in my .30-06. I didn't plan on going to investigate, not then. A man who goes looking for a wounded grizzly is a man who wants to die. My plan was to stay inside, stay quiet, and wait. But the sounds didn't stop. Over the next hour, I heard more noises from that same direction. There was a dragging, scraping sound, heavy and rhythmic. There were low moans filled with that same bubbling quality as the roar. And there were more crashes, smaller this time, as if something huge was thrashing around, breaking smaller trees and brush as it moved. It was slowly, agonizingly moving down the mountain,
and it was heading in the general direction of my cabin. Logic was at war with my senses. No bear I had ever encountered made sounds like this. The sheer volume of the noise, the sustained agony of it, didn't fit. A bear in that much pain would either die quickly or quiet down to conserve energy. It wouldn't continue to thrash and roar for over an hour. My curiosity, the part of me that had made me a good warden, started to gnaw at my caution. I had to know what was making that noise. It was a professional imperative, a deep-seated need to understand the environment I was in. That need, I now know, was a terrible mistake. I waited until the sounds seemed to settle in one place, still a good half-mile away, in a dense patch of lodgepole pine and thick underbrush. The sun was getting low, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape. It was now or never. I grabbed my rifle, a powerful handgun holstered on my hip, my heavy-duty flashlight, and my first aid kit. I told myself it was for a wounded animal. The first aid kit, however, felt like a concession to a different kind of fear, a fear for myself. I slipped out the back door, moving as quietly as I could, using the terrain for cover as I began to circle around toward the source of the disturbance. The woods were unnaturally silent. No birds chirped, no squirrels chattered. It was as if every living creature in that valley was holding its breath, listening. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines and the thumping of my own heart. As I got closer, a new element reached me, the smell. It was the coppery metallic scent of blood, heavy and thick in the air. But underneath it was something else, something musky and feral that reminded me of a wet dog, mixed with the sour smell of a rutting buck, but stronger, ranker than either. It was a predator smell, but one I had never encountered before. I slowed my pace, moving from tree to tree, my rifle held at a low ready.
The ground was disturbed. A wide swath of underbrush was flattened and broken. Small saplings were snapped in half, their white wood stark against the forest floor. And there was blood. Splatters on the leaves, dark smears on the bark of trees, and a clear, heavy trail leading deeper into the pines. It was far too much blood for any animal to lose and still be moving. I followed the trail of destruction for another 100 yards, my senses on high alert. The dragging sounds had stopped, but I could hear a low, wet, ragged breathing ahead. It sounded like an old man with pneumonia, a desperate, liquid-filled struggle for each breath. I crouched behind a large granite boulder, peering through a gap in the rocks. What I saw broke my understanding of the world. It was lying at the base of a massive, fallen pine, the one I must have heard break earlier. It wasn't a bear. It was long, impossibly so, and covered in coarse, dark fur, almost black. It was lying on its side, and from my vantage point, I could see a massive pair of shoulders, a narrow waist, and long, powerfully muscled legs that were bent at an angle that felt wrong, not like a wolf or a bear, but more like a man's. One of its arms, long and sinewy, was pinned beneath the fallen tree trunk. The other was stretched out, and at the end of it was a hand.
a hand with 5 long, claw-tipped fingers, currently clenched into a fist in the dirt. But the head, that was the thing that stopped my heart. It was canine, unmistakably canine, like the head of a massive wolf or a timber wolf, with a long snout, powerful jaws, and pointed ears. One ear was torn, and its muzzle was matted with blood. Its eyes were open, and they were glowing with a faint, pale yellow light, reflecting the dying rays of the sun. They were fixed on the sky, and with every ragged, gurgling breath, a pink foam flecked its lips. Its injury was horrific.
The fallen tree, a monster of a pine easily 4 feet in diameter, had crushed its lower torso and legs. Its back was clearly broken. The sheer, impossible strength it must have possessed to drag itself and that tree, even a few feet down the mountain, was staggering. I was looking at something that should not exist, something that was dying in a way that no natural creature should be able to endure. My mind was racing, trying to categorize it, to fit it into some box my experience could explain. A freak mutation? Some kind of escaped hybrid animal? None of it made sense. The proportions were all wrong. The combination of features was a biological impossibility. It was built like a sprinter, a brawler, with a lean, muscular frame that stood in stark contrast to the bulk of a bear. Even lying broken on the ground, it radiated an aura of terrifying power. I stayed behind that rock for what felt like an eternity, just watching it breathe. My fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but my training as a warden was kicking in. I was documenting, observing. The creature's fur was thick but not long, clinging to a frame that was all corded muscle. I could see the ripple of its diaphragm as it fought for air. The smell was overpowering now, a primal stench of blood, musk, and damp earth. I slowly, carefully raised my rifle, settling the scope on the creature's head. It was the humane thing to do. It was suffering terribly. One clean shot, and it would be over. My finger tightened on the trigger. My breathing was steady. I had put down hundreds of animals in my career. This was no different, I told myself. It was an act of mercy. But I hesitated. Something held me back. It wasn't just the sheer strangeness of it. It was the eyes. As I watched, its head lolled to the side, and those pale, yellow eyes, filled with a dimming light, landed directly on me. There was no mistake. It saw me, and in those eyes, I didn't see the dumb panic of a cornered animal. I saw recognition. I saw awareness. And I saw a deep, weary intelligence. It knew what I was. It knew what the rifle in my hands was for. The look it gave me was not one of fear, but of something far more complex. Resignation, maybe, a flicker of something that might have been curiosity. It held my gaze, and the connection was so profound, so unnervingly sapient that my finger went slack on the trigger. It took another one of those rattling, painful breaths, and a low sound rumbled in its chest. It wasn't a growl. It was deeper, more controlled. It opened its mouth, and the sound that came out was not the roar I had heard before. It was a word. A broken, guttural, barely recognizable word forced through a throat full of blood. Help. I physically recoiled. My rifle sagged in my hands. I must have misheard. It had to be a trick of the wind, a groan of pain that my panicked mind had twisted into a familiar shape. It was impossible. Animals don't talk. But then it did it again. Its yellow eyes were locked on mine, pleading. The effort was immense. Its whole body shuddered. Help me. The voice was a deep, gravelly rasp, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. The words were slurred, distorted by pain and the canine shape of its mouth, but they were undeniably English. A cold dread, far deeper and more terrifying than the simple fear of a predator, washed over me. This wasn't just an animal. This was a person, a monster, a something that defied all known laws of nature. I lowered my rifle completely, my mind a maelstrom of confusion and horror. What could I do? The tree trunk pinning it must have weighed several tons. There was no moving it. Its injuries were catastrophic. Even if I could free it, it would die. My medical kit was laughably inadequate. A pressure bandage? Some antiseptic wipes? It was a mortal wound. I took a hesitant step out from behind the boulder, holding my hands up in a placating gesture. The rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. I don't know why I did it. It was an automatic response, the way you would approach a scared human. I can't, I said, my voice hoarse. The tree is too big. Your back. It's broken. The creature's eyes seemed to understand. A long, shuddering sigh escaped its bloody lips. It closed its eyes for a moment, and a tremor ran through its massive frame. It seemed to gather what little strength it had left. When it opened its eyes again, the pleading was gone. It was replaced by a look of urgent warning. It spoke again, the words coming in a strained, wet whisper. He is coming. He? I asked, taking another step closer. Who is coming? Not alone, it rasped, its gaze shifting from me to the dark woods up the mountain. Hungry, always. Hungry. A branch snapped in the woods behind it. It was a sharp, loud crack that was completely out of place in the silent forest. The dying creature's head jerked toward the sound. A genuine, primal fear flared in its yellow eyes. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The glimmer of intelligence was swallowed by raw, animal panic. It tried to push itself up, its free hand clawing at the dirt, its body twisting uselessly against the crushing weight of the tree. A low, desperate growl rumbled in its chest. I spun around, raising my rifle, my heart hammering against my ribs. I scanned the tree line, my eyes straining in the deepening twilight. For a moment, I saw nothing but the familiar shapes of pine and shadow. Then I saw movement. A flicker of darkness against the dark gray bark of an aspen. I focused on the spot, and my blood ran cold. 2 points of light blinked into existence in the gloom. They were the same pale yellow as the eyes of the creature on the ground, but these were bright, alert, and filled with a terrifying predatory focus. They were about 8 feet off the ground. As I watched, a shape began to resolve itself around the eyes. It was huge, even bigger than the one trapped by the tree. It was standing upright, partially obscured by a thick pine. I could make out a massive, broad-shouldered silhouette, a head with the same pointed, canine ears, and the glint of what I knew were teeth. It took a step forward, moving out from behind the tree, and I got my first clear look at it. If the dying one was a thing of nightmare, this was the nightmare's creator. It was easily 8, maybe 9 feet tall, with a lean, wiry build that spoke of terrifying speed and power. Its fur was the color of charcoal, and its long arms, grotesquely out of proportion with its body, ended in those same 5-fingered, clawed hands. It stood on 2 legs, its posture not quite human, bent forward slightly at the waist, its head cocked to the side as it regarded the scene before it. It wasn't just an animal. The way it stood, the way it assessed the situation, was coldly analytical. It was a hunter, and it was looking at its wounded compatriot not with sympathy, but with cold, calculating appraisal. Like a wolf deciding if a member of its pack is too weak to go on. The dying creature on the ground
let out a choked, desperate whimper. The newcomer ignored it. Its glowing yellow eyes slowly swiveled from the trapped one and locked directly onto me. The intensity of that gaze was a physical force. It felt like two burning coals were being pressed into my mind. There was no curiosity in this one's eyes. There was only hunger and a chilling, absolute malevolence. It lowered its head and let out a low growl that vibrated in my bones. It wasn't loud, but it was the most terrifying sound I have ever heard.
It was the sound of imminent, inescapable violence. It was the sound a predator makes right before it kills. I didn't think. I reacted. I snapped the rifle to my shoulder, found the center of its chest in my scope, and fired. The roar of the .30-06 was deafening in the quiet woods. The rifle bucked hard against my shoulder. I saw the muzzle flash, and I saw the bullet strike home. A puff of dark fur flew from its chest, and it staggered back a step, a guttural grunt of pain and surprise escaping its throat. For a split second, I felt a surge of hope. A .30-06 round will drop a grizzly in its tracks. It should have torn through this thing, but it only staggered. It looked down at the bleeding wound in its chest as if it were a minor annoyance, then looked back up at me. The malevolence in its eyes intensified, turning into a white-hot, murderous rage. Then it moved. It wasn't a run or a charge. It was an explosion of motion. It covered the 30 yards between us in seconds, its long legs eating up the ground in huge, loping strides. It was silent. Impossibly so for a creature of its size. It didn't crash through the underbrush. It flowed through it, a river of black fur and claws and teeth. I worked the bolt of my rifle, my hands clumsy with adrenaline. I ejected the spent casing and chambered a new round. I didn't have time to aim. I fired from the hip as it closed in. The shot went wide, tearing a chunk of bark from a tree to its left. It didn't even flinch. It was almost on top of me. I saw its jaws open, revealing rows of long, yellow, dagger-like teeth. I smelled its breath, a hot, foul stench of rot and raw meat. I tried to bring the rifle up to use as a club, but it was too fast. One of its long arms lashed out. The blow caught the rifle, not me. I heard the walnut stock crack and saw the entire weapon bent into a useless U-shape as it was torn from my grasp and sent flying into the woods. The strength was astronomical. It had bent a solid steel barrel like it was soft lead. I stumbled back, drawing my sidearm, a heavy .44 Magnum. It was a last resort, a cannon of a handgun. I raised it, my hand shaking, and fired. The boom was tremendous. The creature was so close that the muzzle flash singed the fur on its chest. It roared, a sound of pure fury this time, and swatted the gun from my hand as easily as it had the rifle. The impact shattered the bones in my wrist. A blinding, white-hot pain shot up my arm, and I screamed. I fell backward, landing hard on the damp earth. I was disarmed, my right wrist broken. I was dead. I scrambled backward, kicking at the dirt, trying to put any distance between myself and the monster looming over me. It stood there for a second, its glowing eyes boring into me, its chest heaving. Blood, dark in the twilight, was welling from the 2 gunshot wounds, but they seemed to have no effect on its strength or speed. It took a deliberate step toward me, lowering its head, its jaws snapping. This was it. This was the end. I closed my eyes, a lifetime of memories flashing through my mind. The smell of Sarah's hair, the day my daughter was born, the feel of the sun on my face. Then, from behind it, came a sound, a weak, desperate roar,
I opened my eyes. The dying creature, the one pinned by the tree, had somehow managed to get its free arm around a thick, broken branch. With a final, agonized surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, it swung the heavy limb and smashed it into the back of the standing creature's leg. The blow was surprisingly powerful. The branch shattered on impact, and the standing monster buckled, its knee bending at an unnatural angle. It spun around with a furious snarl, momentarily forgetting me. It looked at the dying one with pure, unadulterated hatred. It let out another one of those deep, vibrating growls and limped the few steps back to the fallen tree. It was my chance. My only chance.
I didn't wait to see what would happen. Pain was a roaring fire in my arm, but the instinct to survive was stronger. I rolled onto my stomach and pushed myself up with my good arm. I ran. I ran like I have never run in my life. I didn't look back. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that whipped at my face and tore at my clothes. Behind me, I heard a sickening, wet, tearing sound, followed by a final, gurgling sigh. Then silence. A few seconds later, I heard it coming after me. The heavy, loping footfalls were crashing through the forest, closing the distance with terrifying speed. I was injured, I was in shock, and I was no match for its speed. It would catch me in the open. My cabin. It was my only hope. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, the pain in my wrist a dull, throbbing counterpoint to the frantic beating of my heart. I burst out of the tree line and into the small clearing where my cabin stood.
The porch light was on, a tiny beacon of safety in a world that had suddenly become an abyss of horror. I fumbled with the doorknob with my left hand, my fingers slick with sweat and blood. The creature burst from the trees behind me, roaring in frustration and rage. I got the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut just as the monster's full weight hit it from the other side. The entire cabin shook. The wood of the door groaned, and the frame splintered. I scrambled to my feet and threw the heavy deadbolt. A massive, clawed hand punched straight through the thick oak panel next to the doorknob, splinters exploding into the room. It groped blindly for the lock. I grabbed a heavy cast-iron poker from the fireplace with my good hand and swung it with all my might at the searching hand. I connected with the knuckles. There was a crack of bone, and the hand was withdrawn with a hiss of pain. But it wasn't deterred. The creature started hammering on the door with its fists, each blow like a sledgehammer. The wood was cracking, the hinges screaming in protest. It wouldn't hold for long. I backed away, my mind racing. I was trapped. My two most powerful guns were gone. My wrist was broken. I looked around the cabin, desperate for a weapon, for a way out. My eyes fell on the 5-gallon can of gasoline I kept for the generator. An idea, a desperate, insane idea, bloomed in my mind. The creature was now shouldering the door, the frame beginning to give way. I grabbed the gas can, my left hand struggling with the cap. I managed to get it open. As the top hinge of the door tore loose from the frame, I sloshed gasoline all over the door, the floor in front of it, and the porch outside through the hole its hand had made. I grabbed the box of matches from the mantel, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely hold them. With a final, shattering crack, the door flew open, torn from its remaining hinge. The creature stood there, framed in the doorway, a terrifying silhouette against the last light of dusk. It was bleeding, it was limping, but it was coming. It took a step inside, its yellow eyes burning with triumph. I struck a match, the hiss and flare of it shockingly loud in the tense silence. I tossed it onto the gasoline-soaked floor. The world erupted in a whoosh of orange flame. The fire ignited instantly, racing across the floor and engulfing the creature in a ball of fire. It shrieked, a sound that was no longer a growl or a roar. but a high-pitched, piercing scream of pure agony. It was a sound that was horribly, unnervingly human. It stumbled back, swatting at the flames that clung to its fur, its body a writhing torch. It fell off the porch and rolled on the ground, trying to extinguish the fire, its screams echoing through the valley. I didn't wait.
I ran to the back of the cabin, kicked out the screen of the kitchen window, and scrambled out, falling hard on the ground outside. I picked myself up and ran for the old shed where my truck was parked. Behind me, the front of my cabin was burning, and the horrifying screams of the burning creature were beginning to fade, replaced by the crackle of the flames. I reached the shed, threw open the doors, and jumped into my old Ford. The keys were in the ignition. I always left them there. The engine turned over on the second try, the sound a beautiful, reassuring roar of internal combustion. I slammed the truck into reverse, backed out of the shed, and spun the wheel, pointing the nose down the long gravel road that led to civilization. I didn't look back at my burning cabin. I just drove. I drove all night, my left hand on the wheel, my broken right arm cradled in my lap. The pain was excruciating, but the adrenaline kept me going. Every shadow on the side of the road was a monster, every gust of wind the sound of pursuit. I finally reached the highway just as the sun was beginning to rise. I pulled over, my body shaking uncontrollably, and finally allowed myself to break down, the full weight of the night's horror crashing down on me. I ended up at a small clinic in Bozeman. I told them I had fallen and broken my wrist while hiking, and that a propane lantern had exploded, starting a fire that destroyed my cabin. It was a flimsy story, but they were doctors, not detectives. They set my wrist, gave me pain medication, and told me to report the fire to the sheriff. And I did. 2 days later, I sat in the Gallatin County Sheriff's office, across the desk from a young, clean-cut deputy who looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. I told him the lantern story again. It was the only story I could tell. What was the alternative?
To tell him I'd been attacked by a 9-foot-tall bipedal wolf man after having a conversation with its dying friend. They would have sent me straight to the state hospital. He took my statement, nodding politely. A Forest Service fire crew had already been up to the site. They had confirmed the cabin was a total loss, burned down to the foundation. The cause was listed as undetermined, but my lantern story fit well enough. The case was, for all intents and purposes, closed. No one was hurt. No laws were broken. It was just another unfortunate accident in the backcountry. But something was bothering me. I asked the deputy if the fire crew had found anything else, any remains. I told him I was worried a bear might have been drawn to the fire. He checked the report. "No, Mr. Thorne," he said. "Nothing. Just the cabin. The fire burned pretty hot. Probably wouldn't be much left of any animal that got caught in it." He said it so casually. I knew what a hot fire did to a body.
I'd seen it before. There were always bones, always a skull. But they had found nothing. As I was leaving, a familiar face came out of an office down the hall. It was Mark Jensen, a man I had worked with for 20 years before he got promoted to a desk job and I retired. He was the sheriff now. He looked older, grayer, but his eyes were still as sharp as ever. He recognized me immediately and pulled me into his office. We made small talk for a few minutes about my retirement, about his kids. Then he leaned forward, his voice low. "Alex," he said, "I read the preliminary report on your cabin. That's a hell of a thing. You're lucky you got out." I just nodded, my mouth dry. He looked at me, his gaze steady. "The official report is going to say faulty propane line. Cleaner that way. But you and I both know you're more careful than that. You want to tell me what really happened up there?" I looked at my old friend. at this man I had trusted with my life on more than one occasion. I saw a flicker of an opening, a chance to unburden myself of this impossible truth. I opened my mouth, the words, "It wasn't a bear," on the tip of my tongue. But then I stopped. I saw the uniform, the badge, the reality of the world he represented. A world of rules and laws and things that made sense. My story had no place in that world. I shook my head. The lantern exploded, Mark. I was just lucky. He held my gaze for a long moment, and I could see he didn't believe me. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "All right, Alex, if that's your story. But let me give you a piece of friendly advice. Stay out of the Absarokas for a while. Stay out of the deep woods altogether. We've had incidents. Hikers gone missing. Campsites found torn apart. We always call it a grizzly because that's what people can accept. But sometimes the tracks don't match." He stood up, signaling the end of our conversation. As he walked me to the door, he put a hand on my shoulder. "Take care of yourself, old friend," he said. "There are things in those mountains that don't have names, and it's best to leave them that way." That was the last I spoke to anyone about it. There was no official validation, no investigation, just a private, unofficial warning from an old friend to stay away. I sold the land where my cabin once stood. I couldn't bear the thought of going back there. I moved from my house on the edge of town into a small apartment in the middle of the city. I can't stand the silence of the country anymore. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of leaves outside my window sends a jolt of fear through me. I don't hunt anymore. I don't even like to go to city parks. The sight of too many trees close together makes my chest tighten. My guns are locked in a safe that I haven't opened since that day. They were useless anyway. What good is a rifle against something that can bend the barrel with its bare hands? But the worst part, the part that keeps me awake at night, isn't the memory of the attack. It's not the sight of the creature burning or the pain of my shattered wrist. It's the memory of the one that was dying. It's the memory of its voice, the words it spoke. "Help me." A plea for mercy from a monster. And the warning. He is coming, not alone, hungry, always hungry. It wasn't just a random, violent encounter. I had stumbled into the middle of something. A conflict, a hunt. One of them was hunting the other. Why? I will never know. But the implications are what haunt me. They are not just mindless beasts. They are intelligent. They can reason. They can speak. They have conflicts. And they are out there, living in the dark places of the world, just beyond the edges of our maps and our understanding. I don't know what they are or where they came from, but I know they are real. And I know that what Sheriff Jensen said was true. We call them bears or mountain lions because it's easier, because the truth is too monstrous for our world to accommodate. The truth is that we are not at the top of the food chain. We are just blissfully, dangerously unaware of what walks in the woods when the sun goes down. My experience taught me that the wilderness doesn't just have teeth, it has secrets. And some of those secrets have names we can't even begin to comprehend. And they are hungry, always hungry.